give a lightning quick introduction to Professor Ruth Grossman. Yes, I have known Ruth for about 10 years as friend and colleague and collaborator. We met at a conference, immediately agreed we should write a paper together, and only about 9 years later that has been published. Ruth works on communication in children with autism spectrum disorder, face-to-face communication. She's done a lot of research on the impressions that people form of speakers, people with autism. And we've been looking together at vocal markers of autism. I think that's what I have to say. Please,
Sounds
Ruth,
good.
take it away.
Thank you. And thank you all for having me. When I sort of said that I was going to come visit, and I said, should I be giving a talk somewhere? And so I feel like I invited myself, so I appreciate that you're actually here to come to the talk. So I'm going to do a little bit, it's a little bit of a romp through sort of all of my work over the past decade or so, looking at some of the things that have motivated what I'm doing, some of the things I've been finding, and where I think I'm going to go next. Just to make sure everybody's on the same page, which is not moving to the next slide. There we go. Just a very brief introduction to what autism is. So as of the latest definition, autism has two main domains, which is about social communication, so difficulties with social communication and social interactions. And that includes things like nonverbal facial, nonverbal expressions like facial expressions. It includes social emotional reciprocity, so relating to other people, and it includes relationship formation. So, social emotional reciprocity can be just sort of in the moment. Relationship formation obviously is something that is a little bit more longer term. And then the other domain is about restricted and repetitive interests and behaviors, and that's not just about like being fixated on cars or trains or something like that. It also includes sort of stereotyped and routine verbal behaviors. So that there is a communication, a language, verbal domain in that repetitive, restrictive behaviors as well. Okay, a quick note on terminology. So in the last few years, we've started moving away from what we've been referring to as the medical model of autism, which is thinking about autism spectrum disorder as something that is a sequence of deficits that is classified as a disorder, and where any behaviors need to be changed and adapted in order to reach sort of normal, right, and fit in with society. And moving more towards a social model where we can look at differences in behavior, so taking more of a neurodiversity approach. I'm not sure exactly where to stand, so I'll just be moving around a lot. Acknowledging some of the strengths in autism as well, and how to use some of those strengths to support communication and social success, and viewing things from within this double empathy model, which is about saying that when an autistic and a non-autistic person talk to each other, both sides don't really understand how the other one operates and how the other one communicates, and both sides need to learn about that, right? So that we're not putting the onus of improvement, so to speak, only on the autistic person, but that it's really seen from both sides. There's a lot of big discussion and debate about that, and autism is a very heterogeneous disorder, or whatever you want to call it at this point, condition. And there are people who require significantly more support, who have no access to any kind of communication system at all. So, right, these things don't necessarily all hold for everybody who has autism. But for the population that I'm going to be talking about, which are people, mostly adolescents, who have strong language and cognitive skills, they're able to communicate verbally very well. They're able to be in a normal school system, in a normal school setting, often without supports, but they still struggle with this social emotional relatedness. They still struggle with forming relationships. They still struggle with connecting with other people. So that's the population that I'm talking about. And then the other piece to this, just about terminology, is that there is another debate, so many debates in the autism world, about person first or identity first language use. So I don't know what you do here, but clinically in the US, very often, most of the time we talk about a person with autism, right? We use the person first language. So first you are a person, then you have autism. However, a lot of autistic adults prefer identity first language. I am an autistic person, because autism isn't something that is just layered on top of who I am. It is part and parcel of who I am. It's part of my identity. So I am autistic, or I am an autist, right? So I have predominantly moved to identity first language at this point, but I just want to acknowledge that different people prefer different things for their own lives, and if you're having a conversation with an autistic person, it's always good to ask. But this is kind of where I'm talking about. And then there's this whole neurodivergent versus neurotypical. Oh, there's supposed to be an L there. So I've been referring to autistic people, and sometimes I will say non-autistic people, which is really honestly much too vague and broad to be useful. So I often then also refer to neurotypical. In some of my slides, you will see abbreviations NT for neurotypical. You may also see TD for typically developing, which is the terminology I used before. So there's some older graphs in there that have that terminology. So this is all the preambles. Okay, as Ethan said, I'm really interested in first impressions. I'm interested in how people perceive an autistic person in the social environment, and what impact that impression has on their interactions. So why do we care about that? We know from the broader psychology literature for many, many years that first impressions are formed very, very quickly, fractions of a second, right? We make judgments about whether we think somebody is likable or smart or trustworthy or any of those things. And we know that those have lasting impact on relationship formation, on any aspect of life, whether you get hired or not, whether whatever else you might be interested in doing. Nalini Ambady did some work about thin slices. This is the terminology that she coined, which I really love. And she wanted to say that some of these thin slices, sort of brief moments of an experience with another person, can be used as a proxy for a broader experience. So she would do things like record a conversation between a patient and a doctor that went on for, I don't know, a half an hour. I don't know any doctor who talks to their patient for a half an hour anymore, but let's say it was a longer conversation. And then she would extract 30-second or so slices, thin slices from those conversations, and she would show them to participants who didn't know anything about the interaction and had them rated for a number of factors. And she would find that, for example, some of these ratings for the thin slices could predict which doctors were more likely to be sued for malpractice. So based on 30 seconds of interactions, without knowing the context, people were making accurate predictions about what the potential outcome of that social interaction was going to be, right? So that's sort of the model that I'm looking at for autism. Like, if you're looking at a thin slice without context, can you still make predictions about, or are there perceptions that are relevant to what the broader outcome of the social interaction is going to be, or the broader outcome for that individual, for that autistic person? Okay, so this is my goofy little slide about sort of the interactions that I'm interested in. So we have our autistic person here who's putting himself out there in the world, and he's saying hello to people, because remember, these are all verbal individuals, right, with strong cognitive skills. They are out there in the world. They're interacting with people. They're communicating. And they're sending these social signals to whoever is around them, and they, for some reason or other, are having trouble understanding the social signals sent by this person, or are forming negative first impressions, right, or just something is not quite what they're expecting it to be. So they're sending their own maybe standoffish vibes back, which then the autistic person has trouble understanding themselves. So that is sort of that reciprocal circle of difficulty with social relatedness, right? Both in the expressions of the autistic person and in their ability to perceive and understand the social signals of the people around them. All right, so here's sort of how I got started with this. I started with a story retelling task where I had a young man tell stories about the safaris that he has been on. The device that we used was that he has a TV show for kids where he tells these stories about his adventures, and he was really tired and he needed a vacation, and he was auditioning people for a vacation replacement. So we asked the kids who came into the lab essentially to audition for his vacation replacement, and so he would tell a story on video, and then he would say, okay, now you tell the story to the camera in a way that would make the kids at home be interested in what you're talking about, right? So, which is our way of saying, please be animated, without saying, and please be animated. So that was the setup. And then we pulled 1 second clips from what the kids said. And 1 second is long enough to hear something like, what are you gonna, that's it, that's a second, right? And we took these 1 second clips of autistic and neurotypical kids and we showed them to a whole bunch of neurotypical adults, otherwise known as Emerson College undergraduate students, because that's what I had lying around the house. And I said, tell me whether the person that you just saw or heard is socially awkward or not. That's it. No definition of what socially awkward was. No mention of autism. I actually questioned them afterwards if they knew anything about autism. If they did, I excluded them from the study. I said, you know, and I looked at the data that came out of that. And I showed people videos, 1 second video clips. I played them 1 second audio clips. I showed them silent video clips, so just the video, no audio, and I showed them photographs as well. And what I found reliably is for all of the modalities, the autistic kids were rated as significantly more awkward than the neurotypical kids. Now you can see it's not 100% and 0%, right? We're all awkward at different times, and these are teenagers, so they're by definition awkward. And then also you're just getting something in the middle of it, right? You're just getting, what am I gonna, right? It's I mean, we started it at the beginning of a phrase, but still it's an awkward thing to look at a second extracted from somebody. So it's not all or nothing, but there is a very strong and robust effect that shows that the autistic kids are persistently rated as more socially awkward based on as short an exposure as 1 second than the neurotypical kids. Okay, so then the question is, well, what does that mean, and where does that sort of go? You know, was this a fluke, right? This is where we started. So we did another paper. It was collaborative with other labs. This basically has been replicated in a number of different ways in a number of different labs, and the findings are persistent. And we asked a few more follow-up questions, not just is this person socially awkward, but what does that mean? You know, do you care? Right? Okay, this person's awkward, but. So we started asking questions like, you know, how likely do you think this person is to start a conversation? How likely do you think this person has a lot of friends? Do you think they get along well with others? Do you think they spend a lot of time alone? So a lot more questions about what do you think the social realities of that person are, right? Because you could tell me, well, they're awkward, but I don't care. I'm still going to hang out with them. Or you can say they're awkward and I think I'm going to stay away. And I don't think that person has a lot of friends or hangs out with people. And so what you find is that basically the result persists, right? No matter what the question is that we ask, it's always the same. The neurotypical kids who are here in blue are rated as more likely to start a conversation, more likely to have friends, more likely to get along well with others, less likely to spend time alone, and less likely to be awkward, right? So through any of these questions in different domains, the findings persist. Now, one of the things that is sort of wrong with all of these data is that we're asking adults to rate adolescents. And we know that adolescents are a different species from adults, right? And the question really is, do these adolescents, these teenagers, get along with other teenagers, right? Like it doesn't matter so much whether they can relate to an adult in the same way. It's about, how about their peer group? So I did that study. I brought in neurotypical and autistic teenagers to rate the expressions of neurotypical and autistic teenagers, right? So there's a lot of data on this. I'm going to go through this in a little bit. So let me see, the videos of autistic kids are in blue. The videos of neurotypical kids are in green. And these are all the ratings produced by neurotypical kids who were in the lab producing the ratings, right? So there's the stimulus kids and the participant kids. And what you see is that, again, the findings persist, right? So the autistic kid, the neurotypical kids don't want to have lunch. Actually, they don't want to have lunch with anybody, really. They're not willing to sit at a table with anybody they don't know, but definitely not with the autistic kids, right? Not really willing to start a conversation. They think the autistic kids are much less likely to get along well with others, and then I had to, just to keep the directionality the same, so I reversed these two, right? So that lower scores always mean sort of less favorable ratings. So the autistic kids are perceived as more awkward and spending more time alone. That's what the neurotypical adolescents produced, which is similar to what the neurotypical adults produced, right? What about the autistic adolescents? What did they do? Well, they did more or less the same, except that they were a little harsher. They definitely don't want to have lunch with an autistic kid. They might be willing to have lunch with a neurotypical kid, but sort of, borderline. Don't want to start a conversation. They think the neurotypical kids are a lot more likely to get along well with others, and the autistic kids are significantly more awkward and spend more time alone in their perception than the neurotypical kids. So both cohorts, right, within and across diagnostic group, have these significantly poorer social perceptions of the autistic kids than of the neurotypical kids. Now, there's a couple of interesting parts to this when we're sort of following up on, sorry, I'm trying to move the Zoom video so I can see my notes. This piece right here, the not wanting to have lunch with the other person, kind of got me started on, well, what are the questions that we're asking, and are they valid questions, right? I was thinking about, I would sit at lunch with this person as something like, well, would you want to spend time? But for a teenager who's thinking about an American middle school lunchroom, right, where you sit and who you sit with is all about your status and your environment. I don't know if, I'm sure you've watched plenty of those movies, as have I. I've never grown up in a middle school lunchroom, but I hear it's a horrible place. Anyway, but so, they may be perceiving that question very differently than I had intended it, right? So, and maybe the autistic kids are thinking about these questions differently than the neurotypical kids. And so one of the things, actually, just to prove that point, is I looked at correlations between some of these questions. And what I found is that the two questions, does this person get along well with others? And does this person spend a lot of time alone? For the neurotypical participants, those are highly correlated, right? If I think you're getting along well with others, you're also not going to spend a lot of time alone, right? Remember, I've reverse coded this one. So higher means, less time alone. So if you're getting along well, you're not going to be by yourself, right? That to me makes sense. Those things are correlated. For the autistic participants, those two questions are not correlated. So maybe spending time alone is not a bad thing, right? And it has nothing to do with whether you get along well with others or not, right? We're operating on a different social reality and different understanding of what a social interaction is. Okay. So maybe these questions are not meaningful. Maybe it doesn't matter that they're rating people poorly, right? That doesn't actually have an impact. Except one of the things I also looked at is eye gaze. So while the kids in the lab were watching these videos of autistic and neurotypical adolescents, I also tracked whether they were looking at their faces or, not. Hello. And what I found is that both groups looked significantly less at the faces of autistic kids than they looked at the faces of neurotypical kids. And there's actually, so the lighter bars are autistic participants, the darker bars are neurotypical participants. So the neurotypical participants overall looked more at faces than the autistic kids did, but both groups preferred looking at the faces of the neurotypical kids than the faces of the autistic kids. So that kind of then jives again with the way they answered the questions, right? No, I don't want to spend time with them. I don't even want to necessarily look at them as much as I look at a neurotypical person, right? So there is definitely something there. There's a reality there that we're still sort of trying to figure out. Okay, so what is it that they're looking at? What are these faces like? What is the difference? What are people picking up on within, again, a second to say, nah, something not quite what I had in mind about this person? Okay, different kinds of facial expressions. And remember, the ones that I showed people were elicited, as in, please do this into the camera, right? And be animated and have these emotions and that kind of thing. So it's basically all mimicry, a little nature mimicry example here. And it's about following instructions, about mimicking something that you see before you. But that actually relies on a lot of cognitive processes, right? If I tell you, I want you to smile as if somebody had just given you a gift. You have to process my instructions, the verbal part of it. You have to understand the social context. You have to understand what that emotion means. And then you have to figure out how to produce it. So there's a big chain of things that you have to do cognitively in order to get to that result, which is very different from just seeing something that you find funny and smiling or laughing, right? So one of the questions that I then had was, well, what about spontaneous expressions of autistic kids? Are they also different from those of the neurotypical peers? Or are we just penalizing them for somehow not processing our instructions and our social construct of what it means to portray something as angry or happy or sad? All right, so here's what I did. This is my lab. I know it looks messy, but there's like order to the madness method here. All right, so the kids were sitting here and watching things on a screen there. There are a bunch of motion capture, infrared motion capture cameras and high-speed video cameras around them to capture what they're doing, or focus on their faces. And then over here is sort of the control center where the research assistant got to sit and manipulate what was on the screen and record things. Okay. What we did is we showed kids a bunch of YouTube videos. We basically put together a sequence of YouTube videos that were meant to elicit a facial reaction. And that's, you know, you've been on YouTube, you can find things that make you laugh and you can find things that gross you out. Like those are basically the main categories of emotional expressions that we can get from YouTube, and we got plenty of that. I had to have a conversation with the research assistants who are all, you know, young women in their 20s, and for things to make you smile, they kept finding cute kittens and babies, and I'm like, no, our participants are 12-year-old boys. Like, you have to find videos of people hurting themselves, and then they will laugh, and that's what happened. So, okay, some of the babies and cute kittens stayed. Actually, funny dog videos were the other ones that were effective. Some dogs running into walls in their sleep. Okay, so we showed them these. Basically, we said, okay, here you are. Please sit. We're going to start the next task. Oh, wait, there's a problem with the computer. Let me go over here and get it ready. You just watch these videos. Somebody put this together. Have fun. We didn't tell them that we were using this as a task. We didn't give them any kind of instruction. This was just, you hang out here and watch these videos, okay? And we recorded their facial expression. That we did tell them in the beginning. This is like in the middle of a 2-hour session in the lab where we told them they're being recorded at all times, so it's not like we lied to them about being recorded. The camera never got turned off. And we recorded their facial expressions and their vocal expressions, and we coded them. So the first pass analysis was to code them just for how expressive were they on a scale of 1 to 4, whatever it was. I don't remember actually. Did they laugh? Did they vocalize? Did they, make any kinds of sounds that were not laughter? And my wonderful colleague and former postdoc Emily Zane published a paper on this a few years ago that shows that the autistic kids were overall more expressive than the neurotypical kids. Let me say that again. The autistic kids were more expressive than the neurotypical kids. So we're not talking about flat, monotonous, robotic autistic kids. They were talking to themselves. They were laughing out loud. They were commenting on the videos. They were doing all manner of things while a lot of the neurotypical kids just kind of sat there and watched. All right. So then the question was, well, why? And maybe it's because they're interpreting this social scenario differently. Right? Here's the research assistant, there's the kid. Research assistant is not visible behind a short wall, but they're still in the room, like they're there, right? So is it that potentially the autistic kids are still trying to have a relationship with that research assistant over there? It's like, oh, this is funny, you over there, I know you over there, this is entertaining me, thank you. Whereas the neurotypical kids maybe are doing the opposite and are saying, oh no, there's a person in the room, so I'm just going to rein myself in. Right? So different understanding of social display rules potentially, but based on the data that we had, we really couldn't tell. So Emily did a brilliant follow-up where she essentially replicated this, different videos, and she said, she brought the kids in and she said, here you are, disappeared behind a half wall, I'll be over here doing this thing, right? Watch these videos. And then at a different point in time during the research visit, she did that again, but this time she said, I'm going to leave the room to do something somewhere else. I'll be right back. Closed the door behind her, right? So now we know there are two different conditions. One is the semi-social, is the person still in the room or not? And the other one is, no, the person is absolutely not there anymore. And what she found, so let me break this down for you. The red bars are the truly alone condition. The blue bars are the semi-social, the person's still kind of in the room condition. This is the data from the autistic groups. This is how expressive they were, right? And this is the data from the non-autistic group. And what you can see is that the autistic group is significantly more expressive in both conditions than the non-autistic group. The non-autistic, the neurotypical kids don't really care whether you're really in the room or not. They're just doing their thing. The autistic kids are significantly more expressive in the semi-social environment, and then even more expressive when you really leave the room. So when they're really on their own, they're just letting it go. They're letting it all hang out. They're having fun with these videos. They're emoting, they're expressing to nobody in the room whatsoever, right? Which is fascinating. They're being very socially, emotionally expressive to no one, right? So that actually speaks to autistic individuals potentially holding back, right, what their natural expressiveness would be in a social environment, probably because they've gotten a lot of negative feedback for how they behave in social environments and therefore are trying to rein themselves in. Okay, so now I really want to know what these facial expressions look like, right? What are they actually doing? And these data were just coded on how overall expressive are you, right? How much laughing, how much talking, how expressive are you? And I wanted to know it in more detail. So we took these same YouTube facial expressions. What you see on their faces here are reflective markers for the infrared motion capture cameras, so we can get some objective measures of these facial expressions as well. But I had human coders give me a frame by video frame analysis instead of coding of when does an expression start and when does it end. For how long a time while they're watching these videos are they expressive, right? And then do that separately for the ones that are negative, that should evoke a negative reaction, the really disgusting videos of like somebody eating a sheep brain for no reason whatsoever and eating life spiders, like really disgusting stuff, versus the ones that are eliciting something positive, like, you know, the cute babies and kittens and dogs running into walls. And we just said, you know, is it a positive expression or is it a negative expression? And how long does it last? So, you want to play along? What about this? Positive or negative?
Negative.
Okay, how about that one?
Negative.
Negative? Did I hear somebody say positive?
Potentially.
Potentially positive? What about this one?
Positive.
Positive, and that one?
Negative.
Okay, so all four of these faces were in result to watching disgusting negative videos. These two are autistic. And what you just did yourselves as a group is to highlight our findings, which essentially are that, and I'll get to this repeatedly, autistic faces are harder to read. They're more ambiguous than neurotypical facial expressions. And the other part of the finding, so this one is definitely rated as positive. This one is like maybe sort of on the edge. And push comes to shove, in most cases, those wound up being ultimately coded as positive. We did a lot of co-coding, like 100% of the data were rated by at least 2 people. And then if the 2 people disagreed, we brought in a third person. And if there was still disagreement, we had a whole consensus coding conversation. Like, these were very thoroughly coded. And what we found is this. This is, and again, this is duration of response time, right? How long did you have which type of expression in response to a negative or positive video. So these are this is the duration of negative facial expressions in response to positive videos. Like, that almost never happened. These are, These are negative response times to negative videos, like you would expect them to be. And there's no significant difference between the two groups. Positive response time to positive videos. The autistic group has significantly longer positive expressions in response to positive videos, right? This is that overall greater expressiveness. This is where you can really see it. But then the other surprising piece was that the autistic kids also had significantly more positive response time to negative videos. And this is what you were noticing yourselves when you were looking at these videos, right? So they are responding to these videos very much. Like overall, all of these bars are slightly higher. It's not always significant, but we know that overall they are more responsive and reactive. And it seems that they have sort of our interpretation of their expressions has a positive bias, right? They're perceived as smiling or having some sort of a positive reaction even when the stimulus is negative. And you can see how that could lead to some social difficulties, right? If you're perceived as smiling at a funeral, that's not a good thing. And I'm actually giving you that example because that was what an autistic woman told me a couple of weeks ago, that she had to be told at some relative's funeral not to smile. And she wasn't feeling happy, right? And she didn't know that is how her facial expression was being read. But that's the social disconnect that then can happen, and that can lead to miscommunications and sort of lack of social integration. Okay. Now, I told you about those infrared motion capture cameras that I have in the lab, and this is about really trying to understand objectively what is going on with these faces. How are they different? I can show in a number of different ways that they're perceived differently by a human. And that is, in many ways, in my mind, the most important measure, right? Like, what does another human being think about what's happening with your face or with your social overtures? That's what matters, because we're the ones who are going to respond to that person. But I do want to know objectively what is going on with these faces. So 32 markers on the face. I've been doing this work for a while. I was a lot younger back then. And then we measure distances between certain marker sets, right? So if there's one marker here and two on the chin, and if you go like this, then the distance between these markers increases, right? And the same, like if you start, squinting all angrily, the distance between these two markers decreases. So we looked at distances between markers over time as kids made expressions in response to whatever was going on. So the stimuli that the data that I'm about to show you were based on posed smiles and frowns. So this was like, I want you to smile, I want you to look angry, right? This was just on command, essentially, because we needed something finite and predictable to work on. And this is, again, Emily Zane's work. So if you look at this graph over here, which is for neurotypical, these are facial expressions of neurotypical kids, and the blue band are negative expressions. This is over time, right? These are distances between markers averaged across the face over time. So this blue band is for negative expressions, and this salmon-colored band is for positive expressions. And you can see that the variance is not huge, and that the two bands are pretty much separated, as they should be, right? A smile is a very different thing from a frown. Smile sort of widens and opens everything up, and a frown kind of scrunches everything down and pulls things closer together. If you look at the expressions of autistic kids, you see that the variance is huge, and that the two bands are virtually overlapping, right? So when we said earlier that the expressions of autistic kids are harder to read and more ambiguous, there's the objective data behind that they're just not as predictably separating the movement patterns of their faces for positive versus negative expressions, right? So that explains a lot of what we've been seeing. Okay. All of this was posed expressions, spontaneous reactions, etc. But I'm really interested in communication. So what happens when two people are talking to each other, and what happens to their expressions while they're doing that. Okay, so I had a newer study where this one kid, or there were many of them, but let's take him as an example. So he'd be sitting and having a conversation with two research assistants. So the two research assistants sitting side by side, and then the kid sitting facing them, and the kid is wearing eye-tracking glasses. And the glasses have a little camera right in here, so that gives us the field of view of the kid. And then there's also eye tracking cameras on the inside that shows us where within that field of view the kid is actually focusing his gaze, right? And then we also had a camera right there in between the two research assistants pointing at the kid, so we could get, right, we have every angle of that interaction. So the two research assistants basically started the conversation by saying, we're going to tell you some stories about our lives, and then we're going to ask you to share some, funny or embarrassing story about your life as well. And they would, first research assistant would sort of prattle along and tell a story about how she was in New York. And she said, I saw this woman who looked just like Cruella de Vil. Have you ever seen 101 Dalmatians? Which is a very much appropriate, context appropriate, on topic question, right? Because if you haven't seen 101 Dalmatians, you don't know who Cruella de Vil is, so let me check, right? The other research assistant would then tell some convoluted story about how she went to the gym and she ripped her pantyhose and she said it was really hot. What was a time you had when it was hard to breathe? Which is an off-topic, really hard to figure out kind of a question, right? No, not contextually motivated. And what we did is we took videos, we recorded the videos, the few seconds of that kid as they were being asked that question. We presented those videos with no sound to a bunch of raters, and we said, this person was just asked a question. They were having a conversation. Can't see the conversation partners. They were just asked a question. I want you to tell me, how surprised do you think the person was by what was being said to them? How responsive do you think they were to their conversation partner? Right? Can you tell, based on their expressions, that they were just asked something surprising or something that was totally on topic and expected? Were they reacting, responding to their partner? And then, do they understand? Do they get along well with the conversation partner, etc.? Okay. We had 158 adult raters on MTurk, which is just an online platform for data collection. And here's what we found. So these colors really don't pop, do they? This weird green is the bar for on-topic questions, and the brownish thing is for off-topic questions. And it's how responsive, these are the perceptual ratings for how responsive was the person to their conversation partner, right? And what we can see is that the neurotypical kids in general were more responsive than the autistic kids, and they were more responsive for the off-topic than the on-topic question, as were the autistic kids. The autistic kids were more responsive, significantly more responsive for the off-topic than the on-topic question. Makes sense, right? When somebody asks you something surprising, you react more. You have more of an expression, but otherwise you're just following along and there's not that much to react to. So how responsive was the person? More responsive for off-topic than on-topic. And that's true for both participant groups. Good. Then we asked the question of how surprised do you think the person was by what they saw? The neurotypical kids were rated as being significantly more surprised by the off-topic than the on-topic question. No difference in the ratings for autistic kids. So again, they are more responsive. We're just not sure what that response is, right? It is more ambiguous. It is harder for us to determine that the reaction that we saw was surprise and not something else. So they are emoting, they are reacting in a conversational context as well, right? They are being appropriately reactive to social context, but not in a way that can be easily read or identified by a neurotypical participant who's watching them, or a neurotypical conversation partner. All right, the other data that we collected during this was these eye tracking data, right? Because you saw the glasses that they had. And what we found is that, and we looked at, are they looking at the face of the on-topic speaker during the on-topic question, compared to how much are they looking at the face of the off-topic speaker during the off-topic question. And what we found is that the neurotypical kids who are in red looked a lot more at the on-topic speaker than the off-topic speaker. The autistic kids did not make a difference. So even though they are more responsive in their reactions, even though we don't know how to interpret their reactions, but they are more responsive, they are not actually modulating their gaze in the way that a neurotypical kid would, right? Where the neurotypical kids are really maintaining eye contact with the on-topic speaker or looking at their faces, but not the off-topic speaker. They're making a difference based on social context that the autistic kids are not making. All right, brief note of, I've also been looking a lot at, I love this, Ethan. I'm giving the shortest shrift to the stuff I've been doing with you and Ricardo. Sorry, Ricardo. But so we've been doing some analyses of prosody and prosodic contours and having and acoustic measures and sort of combining in the same way that I'm looking at infrared motion capture as an objective measure of facial movement and human perceptual ratings as the subjective one. We're doing the same thing for voices, right? Looking at acoustic measures of their voices as well as human perception. And what we find is that there are some acoustic measures, specifically pauses and sort of speech rate related measures that are that seem to have an impact on social perceptual ratings, on likability ratings, etc. So if there is a longer pause between our turns, so if I'm talking and then I stop, and then you're supposed to pick up the turn and you don't, you pause for a really long time, that leads to negative social ratings, right? But if you're talking and you just keep talking and you never make a pause inside your own turn, that also leads to negative, right? So it's not just about pauses, it's about where those pauses are and how long they are within the context where they find themselves, right? And that can differentially lead to positive or negative social rating. And pauses are also in this cross-linguistic study that we just published. They're an indicator of sort of acoustic voice identity across languages as well. We know that when we're looking at nonverbal feedback, or in general, just sort of listener feedback, right? So when I'm talking and you're all sitting there listening, on occasion, you have to like nod or say mm-hmm, or something, right? Just something so I know you're still paying attention and would like me to go on, I hope. So we know that autistic individuals provide fewer of those listener feedback instances, particularly for nonverbal. So the orange bars are verbal feedback, like yeah, that kind of stuff. And then the nonverbal is nodding and smiling and sort of head movements and those kinds of things. And the autistic kids, so they're less responsive as listeners in a conversation than a neurotypical person would be, particularly in nonverbal, in the nonverbal domain. All right, so then I have to get to this paper, and I'm going to try to breeze through this. But this is something that I tried to do for like a decade. I've been having this hypothesis that one of the reasons that autistic people may be perceived less favorably in the social domain is because there is an asynchrony between their facial and their vocal expressions. That somehow these two streams of expressiveness are not aligned in time as tightly as they should be, or as they are in neurotypical individuals. And this took a long time to get to this particular publication because we had to invent a lot of methodology of how to look at facial expressions with motion capture, right, and do it not just for a posed smile, but for a variety of expressions, including when there's a speaking mouth, which is really hard to navigate when you're looking at just facial feature movements over time. And so what we did is we had people mimic a two-sentence combination, a neutral sentence followed by an emotional sentence. I went into the kitchen and somebody had stolen my sandwich. And the kids were supposed to repeat these sentences, and then we analyzed their productions. The analysis that we did specifically was looking at Granger causality. So so we looked at the acoustic signal and we looked at the facial motion capture data. And so does the signal from one of these modalities predict the movement of the signal of the other, right? Which it should, because if you're getting more angry with your voice, you also wind up getting more angry with your face, right? And if nothing else, your lips are moving more when you're shouting, right? So there ought to be a predictive time-linked relationship. And what the data showed is that there is a significant interaction there between the two groups and the two different types of sentences. So for the neutral sentences, they're basically doing the same. Granger causality does not differ between the two groups. But when you're adding emotion, so when they're doing more, right, when it's not just plodding along, when they're being expressive, that's when the difference between these two groups starts actually happening. So the Granger causality for autistic kids, they're less, well, the audio and visual signals are less Granger caused for emotional expressions in the autistic kids than for neurotypical kids. There's less of a time link between those two. Okay, and then just, going back to this question of how do different people interpret some of these findings or some of these stimuli, in the neurotypical participants, the ones who looked more at the faces of the videos that they had to mimic, because remember, they watched a video of somebody doing this two-sentence combination, then they repeated it, right? So I was actually curious about if you're looking more at that face, does that give you more expertise to mimic it better, right? So for the neurotypical kids, that played out. The more they looked at the face, the better they were, the closer their cross-modal coordination was. But for the autistic kids, it was the reverse. The more they looked at the face, the worse their cross-modal coordination was. So again, just an example of, autistic and neurotypical people are clearly perceiving the social world around them very differently, and it translates into different kinds of behaviors when they're putting themselves out there in the world. Okay, what does it all mean? Wish I knew. So we're looking sort of across all of these findings. There's a lot of yes and, right? There's a lot of things on both sides of this equation. So we know that spontaneous, non-conversational autistic expressions are more responsive, more reactive, more expressive than the neurotypicals, right? This is the YouTube responses, right? They're overall more expressive. Autistic participants look less, their gaze is less responsive than the neurotypical gaze to conversational cues, because they're not looking at an off-topic speaker the same, an on-topic speaker in the same way as the autistic kids, but they do have an influence of the speaker diagnosis, right? They are modulating their gaze, but not in the same way that the autistic people do, and that the neurotypical people do. For spontaneous conversational expressions, they are less responsive, but they do modulate to conversational cues. So when things are happening in the interaction, they are actually making some changes. They provide less nonverbal feedback. They respond less quickly, right? These are some of these pauses. Their face and voices are less coordinated. This is the Granger causality thing. And overall, they're rated less favorably than the neurotypical kids, right? But why in all of these things, right? They are reacting, they are responding, they're more ambiguous, but they are more reactive. And they're also more asynchronous. So what does all of that mean? And when we looked at, when I was hunting this asynchrony, I really thought, like, this is it. Maybe it's the fact that they're more asynchronous in emotional expressions. That's what leads to decreased social perception. I've preliminarily looked at some of the ratings for these emotional expressions from this sentence repetition task that I showed you in the very end. That does not hold true. Actually, both groups are rated more favorably for the emotional expressions than for the neutral expressions, which indicates to me that engagement trumps quality, right? If you are engaged, right, you're being rated higher on a lot of these social ratings because you're doing something, right? So you're more with it, you're more participatory, you're more engaged. I still don't exactly know what it is that you're doing, though, right? I don't understand the signal, but you're definitely doing something, and I appreciate that. So somewhere there, that's a discrepancy, right? Like, that's the thing where I'm not sure we're asking the right question, and this is sort of what I'm coming to. I love when my analysis basically means all of this work that I've done may not be, right. But what does engaged mean, right? We're asking questions about what is your social engagement like, but maybe we're misinterpreting or not formulating the questions exactly right. What does engaged mean? Is willing to start a conversation with somebody, is it a positive or a negative? Right, in your mind, is that something like, why are you being annoying and starting conversations with strangers? Don't do that. Right? So there's a lot of unknowns in what these questions actually mean. There's a lot of impact of social expectations, social context. What are these stimuli? What are we making people respond to that I think we don't fully understand. And as much as I always want to grab my participants by the shoulders and say, what were you thinking when you clicked that button? Like, what was your thought process? But as soon as you start doing that, you lose that natural gut reaction, right? I want people to react the way they would react. I don't want them to think about how they're reacting and should they do, right? Because then you lose all of it, all the ecological validity. So there's a lot, I think there's a lot that we're not fully understanding about what the questions are that we're asking and how they're being processed by the individual people that we're asking them about. And then there's other aspects of identity, right? There's gender, race, ethnicity, age, and sexuality. We haven't asked any of those questions. We've started asking questions about if a neurotypical person's looking at a neurotypical person versus an autistic person, if an autistic person's looking at autistic, right? So something about the identity related to the diagnosis we've started asking. But what about other identities? So I'm keeping my eye on the clock, but I do want to quickly show you this. This is a brilliant master's degree student of mine who just presented this poster last week at the Autism conference in Stockholm. And she was looking at social ratings and gender ratings. So she had, we had videos, 15, there's actually 45 videos, but where there's 15 videos of autistic females, adolescents, girls. They're all cisgender, as defined by their parents when they came in, and 15 neurotypical females. And then we also had 15 autistic males, okay? And we asked sort of our standard battery of first impression ratings, right? How do you think this kid gets along with others, et cetera, based on a few seconds of video. And then we also said, tell me how, on a slider bar, how masculine, how feminine, how either, neither is this person, or either other, neither other, that was it, neither other is this person. And the social impression ratings were very much, kind of what we expected, in that the lighter purple, these colors really don't differentiate. I gotta work on my color scheme. So the autistic females were rated more poorly than the autistic males on 4 out of these 6 domains. So on communicates in a similar way to me, I would be interested in spending time with them, gets along well with others, and peers enjoy spending time with them. The autistic girls were rated less favorably than the autistic boys. When we did the gender ratings, we found, comparing the autistic girls to the neurotypical girls, we found that the autistic girls were rated less feminine, more masculine, and more other neither. So we're kind of looking at a double penalty for being an autistic female, right? There's something about your social behavior that is not what I would like it to be. So I'm rating you down on social ratings, even beyond the autistic males. And somehow, for lack of a less offensive terminology, you're not girly enough to be a girl, right? Like there's something, I'm rating you as more masculine, less feminine, more other, even though all of these girls were reported as being cisgender. We had no non-binary participants in this particular sample. So that really raises a whole host of other questions, right? What other factors are leading to first impressions, and what have we been ignoring all this time? There's a paper by Cook and Over that came out 2 years ago that says, why is all the first impressions literature focused on white faces? Excellent question, right? For the most part, because we never have samples that are racially and ethnically diverse enough to actually have statistical power to compare across groups. But let's do that. So I'm working on assembling a corpus of videos that has, of autistic adults, that has more racial, ethnic, and gender diversity. So we're going beyond looking at gender as a binary, and can look at how all of these other factors intersect with autism and with our perceptions of these people in a social environment. And then obviously, working on, again, next steps, right? Working on within group and across group pairings, having conversations within neurotype versus across neurotype. I mean, there's some lovely studies on that are happening already. But how do these other factors then fit in as well? And it's really about increasing awareness and increasing insight across, in both of the neurotype groups that we're talking about, right? Let's better understand what the other group is doing and how their communicative attempts are coming across, being perceived by others, and what impact that might have. So that's kind of where I'm at, aside from, all manner of thank yous, including, I have to say, my 15-year-old daughter. I gave, she's now 16 actually, but I gave this talk to her, and she sat, I said, well, she wanted to watch TV with me, and I said, how about I give you my talk first, you give me comments, and then we watch TV. And so she sat back with notes and gave me detailed notes on every single slide. And I said I would thank her on the last slide, and she said, okay, but then you have to put it in bigger type, so there you go. Thank you very much.